started. Welcome, everybody. Those in person and those online, thank you so much for joining us for the Africa Center Speaker Series. My name is Abigail Kabandula, and I'm a professor here and also the director of the Africa Center at the Joseph Goebbels School of International Studies at the University of Denver. I am joined today by Dr. Musifiky Mwanasali from Addis Ababa and Dr. Kaire, Ambassador, and Dr. Kaire Mbuende in Brussels. And I will tell you a little bit about our panelists just before we get going, but today we want to talk about a pertinent issue that we have seen on the news almost every month now. Something is up, like an attempted coup. And so we have seen a big resurgence of coups in Africa. And so I have seasoned diplomats today to help us understand what is going on, what can we do on the continent. Yeah. Sorry, we are trying this in-person, hybrid, people across overseas. And so I hope that this take works today. So I'll start with Ambassador Kaire Mbuende. He's the former executive secretary of the Southern African Development Community, SADC. He was also ambassador to the United Nations and ambassador to the European Union and the BENELUX countries. Dr. Musifiky Mwanasali is former political and diplomatic advisor to the chairperson of the African Union Commission. He's also a former senior political officer to the United Nations office in Mali and African Union and United Nations mission in Darfur, UNAMID. We're going to take about an hour, 15 minutes. So just in case you're planning, that's the time we have. I won't take too much time since I've explained that our topic today is about, how we understand what is happening in Africa with regard to recent resurgence of course. So without further ado, I'll pose my first question to get us going. And my first question is directed to Ambassador Mbuende. And we have seen that in the last 18 months, there have been at least several attempted coups in African countries. And the military has managed to take power in, we saw in Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, Mali, and Sudan, while in Niger and Guinea-Bissau that failed. And also notwithstanding in 2017, we had that coup in Zimbabwe. What is the nature of these coups? What are we seeing? How different are they from the ones that the continent experienced in the 1990s? Ambassador Mbuende, you are muted.
Sorry about that. Okay, thank you. But let me go back a little bit to the history of the coups. We have experienced a lot of coups in Africa immediately after independence. Most of them were inspired by the Cold War and the alliance between the different superpowers, and sometimes externally instigated. However, with the democratization in the beginning of the 90s and the Organization of African Unity that later on became the OAU started to take a stand against the coups. Prior to that, dictators or military people who have taken over could come and join meetings of the OAU, but slowly there was this unconstitutional takeover of government. It started, the first one was 1995. There was a coup in the Comoro and it was condemned. And then the meeting of heads of state in Zimbabwe, Harare, also condemned the coup in Sierra Leone and took a decision not to allow military people to be part of the club of the African Union. But the formal decision was taken in Algiers in 1999, and later on in Lomé in 2000, with the Lomé Declaration that bar people who came to power through unconstitutional means from participation in the affairs of the African Union, and and the imposition of sanctions from such. Now, this was a shifting in value system, because before that, there was always an explanation or justification. Now, the new coups is taking place in the context of a generally democratic dispensation in Africa and a pro-democracy value systems. Anybody coming to power through unconstitutional means, it's a pariah. And in fact, they even feel embarrassed and they know that they cannot. There was a time when a coup leader would proudly even chair the African Union or Organization of African Unity at the time. Today, that is unthinkable. And I think that is a positive development in Africa. Now, then we have other challenges. The other challenges is that we have leaders who have been in power for too long. You have failing economies. You have insecurity and all that. And so when you have this situation, people want change. And if you cannot have election and have change, any form of change is almost welcome. And I think some of the coup, some of the people who made coups, they were actually greeted with enthusiasm. And coups are contagious. If you have one coup because they topple a dictator, that coup is sort of condoned. And then, of course, you say, well, please restore order and so on. But if somebody can get away with coup for whatever reason, it's contagious. The next one will also instigate, and it is instigated. That is really what is happening. On the one hand, is a genuine protest or dissatisfaction about the social, political, and economic situation in the countries, and maybe the lack of scope for change of government. And then you have all these coup makers coming in. And then if we are lenient with one, obviously it will encourage others to do so. And that's why it's important that coup makers should be isolated, sanctions must be imposed, and they have to come, they should be forced to restore democratic order. But I think that is a general background. What is important, however, is that there is a genuine shift of value system in terms of pro-democracy. And therefore, while there are coups and unconstitutional change of government, they will not reverse the democratic trend on the continent.
I muted myself, so yeah. Thank you for that. And you hit on some of the images that we saw online. People were celebrating some of these coups that took place. And some of the reasons you've given, insecurity and economic challenges, are not very different from the reasons that we had in the 1990s when the coups were so popular. And so I wondered if you'd want to expand a bit more on that. What you talk about value change, and what are some of these values that have changed that are prompting us to go back to the early 1990s in terms of coups, but also to see some of the same reasons that we've had being given for coups to take place. I don't know if Dr. Musifiky would also want to jump in.
Yes. Oh, sorry. Doctor, are you coming in?
Oh, yeah. Let me just add quickly to what you said. And linking to the follow-up question. Yes, there is an enthusiasm, some form of enthusiasm from the population. We saw people going out in the streets and celebrating and welcoming the putschists. And this goes back to the issue that Ambassador Mbuende raised, the issue of values. the coups that took place during the Cold War era, they left people more or less, indifferent, because they were engineered and sponsored from outside. So it didn't concern really the people, because at that time, the principle was that Africa does not need democracy. Africa needs strong men. All were men, actually. These strong men, so people were very much left out, completely indifferent. There were struggles, but these struggles were squashed very violently and brutally. So it became like a circulation of coup makers. Every 6 months we have a coup and things like that. But this value has changed with the rising of the democratic movement, the democratization since the 1990s, particularly in the French-speaking countries where these coups were like, a daily matter. And increasingly, and as Ambassador said, the coups that we see today, these coups are following three very important issues. The issue of development, there's this African paradox. Why are we so poor when the continent is so rich? And people are protesting about that. There's the issue of democracy that the ambassador spoke about, which I'll summarize in very simple terms. First of all, is just the enforcement of the rule of law, and also the extension of state authority over the national territory. And this is not happening everywhere. And people are really upset and frustrated by that. And the last issue, the issue of security that was raised, and I include here the military and all these sort of differences and divisions that politicians bring into the military. There is a very poor standing internationally. We don't mean anything, you see what I mean? So people are upset about that. And so when a coup happens, it's normal that people, they rejoice. Some people rejoice that at least the change is going to come. A transformation is going to come. Now, the problem you are raising is very important, is that, for instance, why, taking just the third term, why there was a coup in Guinea? Why there was a coup in Burundi, but it failed in 2015? But why is there no coup in Cote d'Ivoire? Because all three countries went through a third term. And that one is, I think it has to do with how these structures, identity, diversity, ethnic diversity, all these issues, how they combine together to do this political dispensation the ambassador spoke about. Maybe you can come back to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the issue is, you find that people want change. And if you look at the situation in some of these countries are similar, because you can ask yourself, why don't you see who, let's say, it's not that they have not been attempting the past, countries like Kenya, Botswana, and all these countries that are generally well governed. And so it's a question of failure of governance. It's a question of course, the breakdown of rule of law in some of the countries, and then the economic issue. And especially you have frustrated young people who are unemployed. And we see those ones everywhere. And basically the military is taking advantage of the general dissatisfaction for the population with the social and political conditions. But obviously there must be certain conditions in a particular country that will make a coup possible. Because when you have strong institutions, even though people will be discontent because of high rate of unemployment, slow economic growth, with strong institutions, a coup may not be possible. Because it's not to say that we don't have similar challenges in most of the African countries. We have similar challenges, but we have stronger institutions in some of the countries.
Yeah, that's a very pertinent point that you bring out in terms of institutions. Why haven't we had, coups in places like, Malawi, Zambia, But I want to leave that for a little bit and bring in the issue of external actors. So we have seen, for example, in Mali, recently France seemed to have exited. One of the reasons that they're giving for leaving Mali is that maybe the Russian influence has increased, and because, well, they cannot really operate with a private company that is state affiliated. But we're also seeing these external actors supporting these governments that come into power using coups, even though we see them, the coups are being condemned by the African Union and ECOWAS. But external governments like Russia and China continue to operate in these countries. They continue to give support to these governments. What is your take on that?
Yes, I think the external forces or countries working with governments, however in whichever way they come to power, I think it's something that has always been there. Even during the worst case of apartheid and the struggle against apartheid, the condemnation, there were still companies who were investing, there were still governments working with that. And I think that is, so it's very difficult. Most of these countries would say that we don't interfere in the internal politics. And therefore, whether you switch from, a democratically elected government to one that has been taken over through unconstitutional means, some of these countries just continue to do business as usual and say, we don't interfere with this. With the internal politics. Obviously, our own organization, the Organization of African Unity, or rather now African Union, ECOWAS, SADC, and so forth, they would always take a strong position because stability, peace and stability in Africa is primarily the responsibility of Africans. And of course, some of our allies who are also supporting us to consolidate democracy on the continent. But most foreign governments and companies, they will just operate as long as they can, as long as they can do business, and that is what has been happening, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. It seems as if it's encouraging those coups, because if they did not engage with those countries, and we have sanctions that are being put by ECOWAS, that would squeeze these countries economically from and discourage them from taking power using coup. Dr. Mwanasali, did you have...
Let me go back. Can I go back to the question that Ambassador Mbuende just replied to? Mm-hmm. The external interferences. This is not new. I mean, we remember at the time when European mercenaries were roaming the continent and creating havoc wherever they went. Mm-hmm. And these, there was Jean Scram in the Congo, there was Bob Denard in the Comoros, everywhere. And sometimes these governments, and after they retired, they went back home and they stayed peacefully, nobody disturbed them. Remember the Comoros were run by a French mercenary. And, these countries they came from, actually, sometimes we're using these mercenaries, as a substitute for their own forces. We remember the story about France-Afrique. Central African Republic is a very good example. At independence, the national hero was killed. So the French, they put somebody there, David Dacko, and when David Dacko did not give them satisfaction, they moved him out, they bring the Bokassa. And when Bokassa did not give them satisfaction, they move him out, they bring back David Dacko. So what we're talking about in the Central African Republic today is a country that has never had a state, no institutions, no leadership. And the conditions where they are in terms of the security, development, in terms of democracy and all that. So what we see today is not new. But remember, in international law, the state is responsible for its domestic security. Mm-hmm. So in my own DRC in Congo, we have the UN for the last 22 years. You see what I mean? this is a complete failure because, and the president of Congo said 2 days ago, and he said, this is not acceptable. But it has been there for 22 years. Also, in international law, the state is free to deal with partnerships that it wants to deal with. And remember, sometimes these outside external influences, they were helping the people who made coup repress their own population. You see, so we need to take a little bit of, how can I put, a balanced view on these things, going back to our history, because we do have a painful history on the continent about these external influences. So going back to your question quickly about ECOWAS, yes, for the AU, there is a coup, there is a coup. You know what I mean? But it's not easy to implement. It's not easy because you have the absolutists, like I can say, ECOWAS, absolutely, if there is a coup, no acceptance, okay? But there's also the pragmatists, those who say, no, let's look case by case, no, you know, you understand. And this was very clear in the case of Egypt. Remember Egypt, when General Sisi overthrew President Morsi, the AU imposed sanctions on Egypt. I remember the discussion in Addis Ababa, in the Peace and Security Council. I remember the delegations that were sent from Egypt to meet with the chair of the commission. It was like, how can you do this to Egypt? You see, but the Peace and Security Council, there's complete division. But eventually, you know, the sanctions were imposed. So it's not an easy thing to implement because of these different external influences, the weight of the country itself, you know, these kind of things. The position that ECOWAS took went a little bit overboard, you know, by creating embargo. Now you are killing a country instead of the way the AU does it. You suspend them, but you work with the country for a certain period of time. We can talk about the importance of transition. So you work with the country for a certain period of time to move them to constitutional order, another problematic concept. So ECOWAS, in my view, went a little bit overboard.
So, Dr. Mwanasali, you're referring to the recent sanctions that have been imposed, is it Mali and Burkina Faso? And
yeah, Mali,
you're saying that the AU's approach of just suspension is enough and not sanctions, because sanctions are hurting ordinary people. But it seems the AU's approach has not been working, because every time we have a coup, they suspend them. They, drag the change of power to civilians. People have seen that, and they have seen that the AU has not been efficient in this. And so there are some critics that do agree with the ECOWAS approach of imposing heavy sanctions on these countries so that they can quickly go back to civilian, like have elections. What
you can say, you can say the AU failed, but I was involved personally in the Comoros case. Okay, I was personally involved in it. And I can tell you all the issues I'm raising about those who say absolutely no, and those who said no, let's be careful and all that was visible. It doesn't depend on the size of the country. You see what I mean? It depends on the friendships and alliances and partnerships. So I was involved personally in this case of the Comoros, but it was successful. You know why? Because Comoros had two kinds of crises. There was an unconstitutional change of government, but there was also separatist movement also. And by the way, speaking of separatism, you remember the Mayotte issue. The French just yanked out of the Comoros, the island of Mayotte, made it part of France. Very much the way the UK did with the Chagos, with Mauritius. Anyway, going back to it, the Comoros, they signed reconciliation, it was called the Framework for Reconciliation in the Comoros, that established a rotation in the presidency, et cetera, et cetera. This is still going on. So that was the case. But it's not always possible because of what I told you, the influence, even the Africans themselves, you see? But definitely sanctions, where did you see sanctions work, by the way? I haven't seen that.
Deterrence.
Yeah.
All right.
In Africa or internationally, you tell me, and I'll be happy to learn from you.
Ambassador Mbuende, what do you think?
Yes.
Should we go more of sanction, or should we just follow what the AU has been done has done in the past, just suspend these countries?
Well, the AU suspends, but also sanctions is imposed, and then there's engagement with the country to bring it to constitutional order. The problem is, the problem is some of these countries, and they could be potential other candidates for coups. If you look at the way the countries are being governed, the frustration of the population about the way they're being, and the hopelessness of the ordinary people, and the urge to see change. And then you have the military, but you can't justify a military takeover, and once it's done. But the good thing, I think, with the AU, I'm not talking about the approach, but the value system and the principles. Even if if a soldier takes over political power, he knows that he's a pariah, and he knows that he has to promise return to constitutional order, which was not the case in the past. In the past, these people were basically welcome as heroes because they overthrown either a dictatorial government or something. That is not the case anymore. And therefore, I would say that I think there have been a certain leniency on some of the coups because of the frustration that we had with the regime that had been overthrown. But once you condone one coup, you just encourage the others to do the same thing. And the best thing is you don't condone any coup, any constitution. Then the question also, when you talk about constitutional or unconstitutional change, you're talking about the sitting president. And you're not even saying, how did that sitting president come to power? Because, of course, some of this has been before these principles were adopted. And then you have some sitting president who have been there for a long time. And then if there's an attempt to overthrow them, then obviously that is unconstitutional change. But you have a sitting president who came also through unconstitutional means. But that, as it may, de facto, and we're saying from now onwards, they we're not going to allow any unconstitutional change of government. And I think that's the position. And to restore constitutional order is something that has to be done as expeditiously as possible.
So, in your experience, you've worked a lot with the AU and the European Union. What are some of the ways that perhaps the AU and the European Union are working to be able to facilitate some of return to civilian government in some of these places that have experienced coups?
Yeah, I think and Dr. Musifiky was right when you talk about Mwanasali, I should say. I lost my chain of thought. But what has been happening is, in terms of the AU and the EU, they're working together on, first of all, I think the diplomatic engagement and preventative diplomacy. Then you have a coup. And after the coup, the first thing, and there are two schools of thought here, if you want. The one is a condemnation route and demanding that they should restore constitutional order. And the other one is engagement with the military. And that is what the AU has been doing, engaging the new government to say, please go to constitutional order. The EU has been putting a lot of resources in the whole peace and security, the conflict resolution mechanism of the AU and so forth, and including peacekeeping through the African Peace Facility. So there's a lot of resources that has gone into that, financial resources and others. But the critical issue is, how quickly you engage the government, and the differences between critical engagement and absolute sanction. I think that is what my colleague Dr. Mwanasali just referred to. We have had cases where the EU felt that we're not strong enough in terms of condemnation, in terms of sanctions. But, the sanctions, the question of how effective are the sanctions, then who's suffering because of the sanction, and therefore one has to take the two approaches. The one is this constructive engagement with the coup plotters or the coup makers, and to try and get them as quickly as possible to constitutional order. But in the meantime, you don't grant them any facility. They don't participate in the meeting of the AU, and if and one could also look at trade sanctions and other sanctions, so that will force them to come back to constitutional order.
Dr. Mwanasali, did you want to say something? I saw your mic go on. And as we transition to another question, I wanted to, the audience. Sorry?
Yeah, I saw my light go on. You want me to go ahead?
No, I was just asking if you wanted to add to that. No, I was just asking if you wanted to add.
Yeah, I'm going to add something very quickly. Ambassador Mbuende is better placed and qualified to talk about the EU. There is indeed a great deal of engagement between the EU and the AU. The areas of convergence, but there's sometimes area of divergence. It's a lot, I saw in places where the EU was adamant about sanctions, because the EU loves sanctions. The EU was adamant about sanctions, where the AU was saying, don't sanction, because people are going to suffer for no reason. You sanction the leaders, but the leaders have everything. It's the people who are going to suffer. One case, you may remember, Ambassador, in the case of Libya, the OAU, there were sanctions after the Lockerbie plane accident. And there was a big problem because the whole international community wanted to sanction Libya. Libya was not even, Gaddafi was not in good terms with many African countries at the time. But the OAU put its foot down and refused to sanction Libya. But everybody wanted, but the OAU said no. I remember the case of Sudan, for instance, where the EU really wanted to sanction to bring al-Bashir down. But the AU said, we cannot do that. We have to engage them and accompany them to the change that the people want. The same thing with the UN, by the way. The UN does not even have a doctrine against unconstitutional changes of government. There isn't. Well, the position you have is like a de facto pronouncement from the Secretary General or from the Security Council members. So in a sense, in terms of unconstitutional changes of government, regardless of the conceptual, confusion of this term, the AU has been on the forefront of this movement. So we always think that we are behind, but we are really at the forefront of this. I remember even Saudi Arabia coming to the AU asking for the AU to impose sanctions on one country. So we should not just be seeing ourselves as behind, you know what I mean?
Thank you.
Well, I must say that we are leading because we've had, you find a solution to a problem that you are facing. And I think we have been facing this problem of unconstitutional change of government, that we had to do something about it. And I think definitely we are leading. But I think in terms of the EU and AU, the differences between, going for confrontational approach with sanction and condemnation to a more dialogue approach, I think it's a fundamental difference. And there have been so many cases where we say we want to solve the problem, but we believe that there are different ways of solving the problem. You recall the situation in Zimbabwe when President Mbeki was engaging the government there through what was known as silent diplomacy, and the EU was saying that why doesn't South Africa just impose sanctions on Zimbabwe because they have the capacity to do so and so forth. But we're saying that we are trying to address the same problem, but differently.
Mm-hmm. Let's come back to that discussion, and I'm hoping that people ask questions on that and can pick it up. So I want to open it up to the audience just because we have a few more minutes that we can do that. And also I want to announce it here online. You can also type your questions in the chat box. I'll be able to read them. But we have a question in the audience. Anna, do we need a microphone? Oh, okay. Yeah, go ahead. I'm going to try and repeat the questions that the students have.
Thank you very much for this session. I'm really learning a lot. The similarities and the differences between the 90s coups and the current coup. Mm-hmm. So I remember Ambassador mentioned countries that are stable, like gave an example of Kenya. My name is Sheila and I come from Kenya. Mm-hmm. And my question is in concern with there's a mention of external influence towards the coups. Mm-hmm. So the case of Kenya and other countries that have experienced instability and have not had issues to do with coup, mm-hmm. Will it be a situation of could it be a situation of Western interest? Because Kenya is somehow considered a darling of the West. Like, there'll be a lot of things that might not go well if Kenya experiences coup to benefit the Western powers. Could that be a reason why some of these countries are experiencing stability in their various setups? Two, there's also the aspect of ethnic diversity in Africa.
Sheila, I'm going to call you up here so that I think you can explain some of the questions that you're asking. Yeah, so because we don't have a mic and we're doing a hybrid, so I'm not sure. Were you able to hear some of the things that Sheila asked?
Well, can you repeat, please?
All right, so she has to, so the first question has to be, sit, you can sit here. So she had a question regarding some of the external actors' influence on the continent and whether the stability of some countries like Kenya is attributed to the fact that these countries work better with external actors. And that's why they've not experienced coups, right?
Yeah, more like they don't work better, but they are special interests.
The West has special interests in Kenya or other countries that are relatively stable, and so that's it's in the best interest, perhaps, in these external actors to keep those countries stable. Yeah. That's our first question. And next question?
Yeah, so the second question.
Yeah, no, take it.
So my second question is in terms of the ethnicity and ethnic allegiance to the political powers. Mm-hmm. So again, I'll give an example with Kenya. We've had a situation here, but in Kenya, we have over 40 ethnic communities. And most of the time, the political parties, the political leaders who come into power have a strong ethnical support. Mm-hmm. In that, even in the military, they're equipped with the leaders from their ethnic background. Could ethnicity also be playing a big role in terms of in support of coup, or it doesn't play a big role in coup and in
okay, yeah. So in situations where there are certain ethnicities who are also maybe affiliated to the military, and would that be a case in terms of coups, should that happen, that these ethnicities might want to take over and the military would support them? So is that Is that your question? Did I get that right? Is that the role, you're specifically asking on the role of ethnicity in military takeovers?
Yes, and especially because the leadership that comes in already is backed up by the population size, the ethnicity. The example, I'll say, like right now, our president is from the Kikuyu community, which is a larger ethnic community. So when he comes into power, he equips the leadership in terms of his ethnic support. So it's more like the civilian ethnicity is supported by also the military leadership ethnicity.
All right.
I don't know what I'm getting.
Okay, you're talking about, having a large ethnicity group that is predominant, and because of that, also have the military supporting that ethnicity group.
So
all right.
Like the power relation.
Did you get the last one? It's basically with regard to ethnicity and militaries supporting the dominant ethnicity group at the moment.
Yeah, we got it. I got it. Yeah.
So.
The first one, Kenya went through very difficult times, and they had their own very challenging moments. And I'm just going to refer to one point to answer the first question. Then the president and the vice president were sent to the ICC. You remember that? And it became a big problem as part of this discussion at the AU. It was a big problem because the president and the vice president could not be out of the country at the same time. And it was approaching the independence. And there was tremendous international pressure to get rid of them by going through the ICC. And Robert Mugabe, the President Mugabe, late President Mugabe, was chairing the AU at that time. And there's a big meeting in October of some years. I'm not going to go into the details, but I remember my boss at the time, Madame Zuma, she met with the Security Council that were passing through Ethiopia. And she pleaded with them and argued with them to handle this Kenya case differently because the way they were pushing it, Kenya was going to break down. And you know what happened. Eventually, the president went and there's something, then it was finished. But there was a very serious risk that Kenya was going to implode if that part had not been corrected. So you have the ICC and you know the argument. Ambassador knows that better than I do. You know, the argument Africa is saying, okay, fine, we participate in this. Why is it only Africans? Why are you not putting issues like Syria, Yemen, and all those things? Why is it just going after Africans? And this is a part of the external influence that the speaker was talking about. And the ethnicity, we have a problem everywhere. There's nothing wrong because people would identify themselves the way they identify themselves. But the problem we have the management of our ethnic diversity, as I mentioned. The management of ethnic diversity is problematic everywhere. And now it's not just ethnic, the Kikuyu, the Kamba, or the Zulu, and the other things. Now it is also the religious diversity, because religion has become now a social identifier. So what it is, it's a real problem. It's being manipulated, et cetera, et cetera. But I let Ambassador, to say a word about that.
Well, I would say that I would like to give credit to the people of Kenya for not having coups, and not because they are darling of the West, because we have seen. The question is that who would prevent? But I think that we have to give them credit. That's one thing. Then we have had political challenges, and you know how it went and how many people lost their lives in Kenya. I think the question of ethnicity is one we cannot escape because we have different languages, and we have different backgrounds. We have different religions. We have even different social categories, and people converge on the one or other of these many identities. But I think it is more the exclusion from resources and opportunities that becomes a problem. Not the fact that we are multi-ethnic, because most countries are in the world. But when you have a monopoly not only of political power, but also of economic and social, and the denial of opportunity, whether formally or informally. That is what led to conflict. I think Kenya has had politicians, the presidents from different backgrounds. Of course, belonging to, we have had President Moi, who followed President Kenyatta. They came from two different ethnic groups. But I don't want to discuss the politics of Kenya, but all I'm saying is not straightforward, it's complex. It's one of the countries, actually, because I have spent some time in East Africa, and I have been following East African politics, particularly the three East African countries, Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. And so there is Kenya, I think, succeeded to build strong institutions very early. And even though, you know, there have been a lot of dissatisfaction, it has always had all these dynamics, differences, strong political parties, strong personality from different ethnic groups. And, you know, you have had historically Dinga Onginga and Jomo Kenyatta. Then you have Uhuru. Now you have, President Uhuru seems to be supporting Raila now for presidency, but this is just, but these are the dynamics of Kenya. And I think we should give the people of Kenya more credit than to say it's because of the West that they have experienced the stability that they have with all the social challenges and the tensions and the very bad situation that we had some, was it 4 or 5 years ago now, you know, where you had this violence that were instigated and they were ethnically based. And because when you are dissatisfied, you know, whether it's social or political, you have to find something through which you mobilize. You can mobilize through religion, or you can mobilize through ethnicity or through other, you know, social, clearly identifiable distinctions. But at the end of the day, is either your ambition is to get political power, or you feel discriminated against in terms of access to resources and opportunities. And I think these are the challenges of most of our countries.
I couldn't agree with you more. And was there another hand? Mbuende, do you want to come up here a little bit and just try and project as much as you can?
Yes. I have, excuse me, I have two questions. One is, Ambassador, you mentioned it earlier a little bit. When we're talking about moving away from coups, while we have some governments that came in power through coups, so what is this going to look like moving forward when those authoritarian governments continue to hold power, but they're not leaving room for democracy or elections? We've seen it in Uganda, where Bobby Wine has been restricted from participating in an election. So how are we going to move forward with not having coups, but we have governments that are holding to power, not letting the people decide their fate? That's one question. I don't expect a true answer. I just want to see how we're thinking about that. My second question is, I was reading this morning, there was an emergency vote in the UN in the situation in Ukraine, and only 5 countries have voted against it, aligning with Russia, and only one African country, Eritrea, was that party voting on that. So my question on that end being, are we seeing positive movements from the continent about condemning Russia's invasion in Ukraine? I don't have the list of those. I think 25 countries abstained from voting. So I don't know which African countries have did that, but only Eritrea, from my view, has voted against that resolution. So how does that look in the situation that we're in right now?
Ambassador Mbuende, did you need me to repeat some of the issues that Wendy laid out? You're muted.
I'm muted, sorry, yes. No, I think the fact that, you know, there are countries that are not democratic as per certain definition of democracy or our definition, and the need for a political change. I think there are so many other ways of bringing about change than coups. And the question is, how long will it take? Coup is a shortcut, but what does it mean? It brings, with a coup, there's always loss of human lives. There are a lot of, you know, so I wouldn't encourage a coup in any situation. But there are social movements, there are different kind of protest movements against, you know, authoritarian governments, and they do succeed actually to bring down governments if people are mobilized, you know. So I believe that there is so many ways to struggle for democracy, to strive for democracy, than unconstitutional means. That is, well, two evils or don't make a good. I don't think that I would, under any circumstances, justify a military coup. I think there's scope for so many other ways of dealing with the situation, even if you are dealing with a repressive regime. There have been many repressive regimes, and there are so many other things one can do in terms of trying to bring about that change. There was a second question. Yes, the second question is the Ukraine, that there are about 35 countries that abstain.
Yeah, and Eritrea is the only African country that voted for
yes.
Russia.
For Russia.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, definitely. I think you know, when you deal with this kind of situation, you want to, you know, you can either just cast your vote and go home, and then you have expressed your opinion in that way, or you want to engage. And then the question is, how do you engage? You know, what role do you see for yourself in resolving an international crisis or a situation which is far away, but at the same time, with the globalization, no situation is far away. We have seen the tension over time, and immediately it had impact, or it had impact on oil prices, and we are feeling it in the remotest of places around the globe. And obviously you're going to see also rising food prices and because of this crisis. So there is no situation that you say that this situation is so far away from us that it doesn't affect us. Any crisis situation does affect humanity and the whole world. And therefore, I think the question is, you know, how do you go about contributing towards bringing an end to the war and finding a settlement because this issue has been brewing for a while. They're not entirely new, and therefore I think it's important that one see that in its proper context, and one doesn't want to go to history, but there seems to be always this unwritten rule in terms of, you know, how close should NATO be, or how close and how close should the Warsaw Pact countries be. You remember the Cuban Missile Crisis and the reaction of the US to that. And then you have almost a similar reaction from the Russian with the threat of I don't know whether it's actual, and because the EU and NATO has really not been forthcoming in terms of Ukraine joining of NATO because of the security concerns. But that as it may, I think there is a serious engagement, and we just hope that the situation will go back to normal and the settlement will be found in that part of the world.
I think you did also touch on a question that had popped up in the online. And we have another question from someone who says, my name is Havenzu Mulunda from Zambia. My question is, why is it that AU is quick to condemn the military coups, but they don't do the same when some leaders attempt to change the constitution? Because I believe some coups are as a result of insecurity by some leaders. Dr. Mwanasali, would you want to respond to that question?
Yeah, there was a proposal, there was a protocol to amend the Constitutive Act of the African Union, like the Charter, the Constitution of the African Union. And in that protocol, one of the provisions was that, look, when we speak about coup d'etat, we always speak about the military. But the civilians do also coup d'etat by changing the constitution, changing the terms of the constitution. I mentioned Burundi, I mentioned Cote d'Ivoire, I mentioned Guinea, and there are many more just, toying with the idea, but maybe they are scared of something. So, but that protocol has never been ratified. I think it's laying down somewhere in the things. And during the discussion, I remember in Lome, because as Ambassador Mbuende said, it started with the Algiers decision in 1999, then it became a declaration in Lome, and then it was added both in the Constitutive Act and in the protocol establishing the Peace and Security Council of the AU. Actually, the protocol is even much more detailed. So the thing is, they want to change. There are people who come there and they come unconstitutionally, they stay there unconstitutionally, and they extend the stay unconstitutionally, but that never worked. If I can say something quick about the question that was raised before, because it was a question about what do we do when we get out of this military coup? How can we get out of it? And that question raised a very important issue, the issue of transition. The transition is, okay, what next? As you can see, the problems that the military claim to try to solve, these problems are deeply rooted, but they give themselves time to solve the problem, but they don't have the means to solve all those problems. Development, capital is foreign, okay? The capital comes from outside. How can you develop with the money from somebody else? It's not possible. Especially that, like in Mali now, they are under sanctions. So they'll never be able to develop. Add to it the fact that all our economies are export economies. We depend on foreign markets in order to earn money. So we cannot develop as long as we are not autonomous in terms of our own production. We don't control our supply chains. Elections, we do elections with somebody else's money. You see what I mean? So, right now, the Congo is preparing for elections next year, my DRC, but there's no money to do it. So when the partners give you money, it comes with conditions. The security we spoke about, the security is us army don't have strategic autonomy. That's why we ask for mercenaries. That's why we ask for, anybody who can extend us soldiers. And as you see in the case of Mali, it is a problem because the French came and they blocked part of Mali from the national army. You see? So getting out is not easy. The problem is the military give themselves, a lot of ambitions. Instead of being choosy, we do this and then we leave the rest to the civilians. But they want to fix the country at once. You can't do everything. It's not possible. It is a big question, actually. And then the longer they stay, it becomes self-preservation. You know what I mean? We are here, we say. Mm-hmm. It's a very difficult question the speaker asked. And go ahead. Yes, I'm done.
Yeah, I think it goes down to the, yes. I think it goes down to the very issue of the essence of democracy. What is democracy? And you can take a very undemocratic decision through democratic means by just simply you call a meeting, and the people who attend the meeting agree to that decision, and the decision then is carried. And so these are the challenges when you deal with constitutions and constitutional amendment. Of course, in some of the constitutions, like my own country, there are certain clauses that are entrenched, which means that you cannot amend those provisions. And things like Bill of Rights and all that, you cannot amend those provisions. They are entrenched. And then there are other provisions that you can amend. Therefore, the challenge is that if you go through a normal process of amending a constitution, whether it's a referendum or whatever, even if it's a question of extending the term of office of the president, it becomes a challenge because, was it done through the normal democratic procedures to actually arrive at a very undemocratic decision? And these are the challenges of democracy. But of course, there are others where there's a shortcut, where there's manipulation of the constitution as opposed to a transparent process of amending the constitution. And if you go through a transparent process of amending the constitution, then by definition democracy become a way of taking decisions. And if the decisions are taken in a transparent manner, and irrespective of, and the worst dictators sometimes also came to power through democratic means. They were elected, and then once in office, they started to implement their policies. And the worst dictators in history, like Hitler, and they were elected. And those are the challenges of democracy. That you can change the constitution through democratic means to extend your stay. And the issue of limiting terms of office, which is in some of the constitutions, is not in all constitutions. And some of the Western democracy, we have had leaders staying for several terms of office because their constitution doesn't bear them from doing so. And their staying in office maybe doesn't even cause any harm because you have strong institutions. And some of these countries, even you can have the system functioning even without a government. That is what strong institutions mean. And we have seen that in countries like Belgium. It has gone for months without a government, and the system was still functioning. And that is what the value of strong institutions.
Mm-hmm. We have a few more hands in the audience.
So I don't know whether we answered the question. Yes.
Yes, you did.
Really, yes. Okay. Good. She's happy. Then it's fine.
Okay. Yeah. We have a faculty member that would like to ask a question.
Thank you so much, ambassadors, for this discussion and all your insights. I have two related questions. One is there's a lot of variation in these new coups. I think when we were listening to the BBC some time back, when the Guinean coup took place, there was somebody who was saying, well, this time, our government has done a classic coup, the way it was done before. And this is basically referring to, the Zimbabwe model, which sort of brought the president to sit down until he resigned. And then we see the Sudanese model following something similar, where the military says we are putting we're in talks with the president and just having these and keeping him for safekeeping. So this variation, how do we? The question is there a continuum in terms of legitimacy based on how the coup takes place? Is there, even though there is this position that, all coups are, not acceptable, but is there a variation even among the unacceptable coups in terms of which ones are slightly more legitimate and which ones are not? Mm-hmm. And then the related question is, if we focus on the case of Chad, it seems like it's a more legitimate kind of coup because the kind of, sanctions, or the kind of sanctions in the broadest sociological sense, the kind of reaction that particular coup took was as if, it was okay for, Idris Deby's son to take over. So could you just elaborate a little bit more, and particularly that case, why does it seem to be more acceptable even to the African Union?
So as you answer those questions, we have about 10 minutes, and we do have a number of questions in the audience, and I've seen one question pop up. So I'm going to ask that you try and shorten your answers as much as possible.
Okay.
Dr. Mwanasali,
yeah.
Yes.
Let me take Chad briefly.
Dr. Mwanasali, please go ahead.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Am I on? Yeah,
yeah.
I'll check Chad very briefly. Yes, there appears to be some contradiction about the situation that evolved in Chad after the death of President Idris Deby. And those who say it was a coup, they justify the position by the fact that, according to the Chadian constitution, if the president is a vacancy at the level of the president, the president of the Senate, or one of those politicians, the parliament, will take over temporarily, organize the elections, and then move on. But those who say that there was no coup, they say no. Actually, in the order of succession, the military succession, and considering the fact Chad is in a very unstable situation, there's a rebellion going on. So it made sense for the stability of Chad to continue with this, the general, who happens to be one of Davy's sons, to continue with him so that, to stabilize the country. Until the country is stabilized, the security is stabilized, then they can move on to the elections. It's the second position they seem to have gained sort of support. And then eventually now they are working on something. I don't know if it's going to work, but definitely is a military in charge. You know what I mean? Yeah, that's all I would say. It's a little bit contradictory, it's true, but those are the reasons. Remember, I was talking about those who are absolutely coup, it's a coup, and then it's a coup, and those who say no, case by case, let's be pragmatic. Yeah. So the pragmatists seem to have won the case in this in Chad.
So does that speak to whether there's a debate to say there's a legitimate coup and not necessarily a legitimate coup? I think that was the other question, the first part of the question.
Yeah, it has always been like that, right from the beginning. I remember in Lome, I was there in 2000. Right from the beginning, there are good coup and bad coup. And it's been argued all the time. The coup that was in Egypt that General Sisi, overthrew the President Morsi, the pragmatists were saying, yeah, it's a good coup. You know what I mean? Otherwise, the Islamists were going to invade Egypt. So it's a debate that has been going on in Africa ever since this doctrine was adopted.
Okay, thank you for that. I have an anonymous attendee. Let me try and read this question. It looks long, saying, unlike other continents, the African continent is one of the continents we experience numerous ethnic conflicts. And as such, ethnic conflicts have a powerful influence on domestic policy and the development of countries. My question here is, why do you think ethnic discrimination still persists in each country after the coup, and whether there is a possibility to end it for the sake of peace and development? If discrimination is repeated, do you think that peace and development can be achieved on the African continent if discrimination against other ethnic groups continues? And in your opinion, do you think the economic factor is more important than the democratic factor in the coup in Africa? So there are two questions there, whether discrimination against other ethnic groups, if it's limited, if we eliminate that, that will facilitate peace and development, and or if the economic factor is more important than democratic factor in coups. Why don't Ambassador Mbuende take the first part, and then perhaps the second part by Dr. Mwanasali. Ambassador, you're muted.
I'm sorry.
That's the pandemic phrase.
Now, is it okay? Yes. Okay. I think the question of ethnic discrimination, first of all, is never formal. I think the only country that has that formal is with South Africa, with apartheid that define ethnicity and treat them differently. Most of the countries, the discrimination is hidden. It's a question of access to opportunity, access to resources. And then you have issues of regionalism. Some regions are more advanced because sometimes they are resource endowed, they have resource endowment there. And, so it's much more complex. But I think what we need to do as leaders is we not to be oblivion to the issue of anything that can cause a conflict. And the question of balance in terms of demography, in terms of now we have even youth, as the rate of unemployment among young people is very high. And that is becoming a formidable force in itself. Therefore, one has to be sensitive to a group of people that are excluded from opportunity. And this exclusion could be deliberate through policy, but also and through social engineering, but also through other objective factors. And even if it's through objective factors, then there must be a deliberate policy by government to address situation in those so that everybody feel that we are part of this country and we are enjoying the benefit of what the country has to offer. And through that, then you can address some of this, because it's generally a developmental issue and is the issue of access to resources. It's not because I speak a different language, but it's because I'm denied opportunities and to resources, to and opportunities. I think that is a challenge of quite a number of countries, and no country really has a policy. Well, there could be some exception of deliberately denying, but it becomes a structural issue.
Yeah,
where certain population groups are left behind because of historical facts and obviously political dominance, and with political dominance come certain benefits that would benefit your neighborhood and so forth, and the others would feel left out. But some countries are very interesting, which are dominated, which are divided between different ethnic groups. And you find that one ethnic group dominate politics, another one dominate economics, and another one dominates academia and the university and so forth. So it's different. One cannot generalize, but we have all these diversities in different countries. But I think what is important is that the leadership should be alive to, to what can cause tensions and that can lead to conflicts.
Thank you. Dr. Mwanasali, would you want to add in a few seconds?
Yeah, very few seconds. The problem is the management of diversity, of ethnic diversity. I'll give you a very simple example, the contradiction, the paradox in my own DRC. The constitution forbids the creation of any political party or any political grouping on ethnic or regional basis. So if you create a political party, it must be national. It cannot be just your kinfolks, okay? But then when it comes to access to resources and all that, you look for your own, because that's where the security is for your own self-preservation. You see the point that I'm raising. So the thing is, it's quite a dynamic sort of interaction between what the law may say and what the practice is on the ground. And I agree with the ambassador, we should be careful about very absolute categories. Because remember also, a lot of people are mixed, like you see in Ethiopia here. I would say like 70% of Ethiopians are mixed ethnically. But the patriarchy, the system that exists here, push the one ethnic group to be on top of the other, as a reason that, my father is from that ethnic group and all that. So it's a very dynamic thing. It's true, economic issues, access and all that, but we need to be careful not to generalize, to sort of, fix them in time.
Mm-hmm. I'm afraid we're out of time. I wanted to ask you one last question about the future of democracy on the continent. ECOWAS Chairperson Nana Akufo-Addo said these coups are contagious. Are we going to see the continuation of coups, or are we going to see elections come back to the continent? In a few seconds, what is your take, Ambassador Mbuende?
Well, I think democracy has gained ground in Africa, and it's irreversible. We have seen the democratic dividends in those countries that are democratic and that have stable institutions, and that's the way to go. And I believe that those who are not stable and democratic will aspire to be stable and democratic. And we have a framework of supporting the process of democratization in those countries that are still lagging behind. So for me, coups is a transient phenomenon, and Africa, democracy in Africa is solid and it's on the march.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Dr. Mwanasali, your last words on the matter?
Yeah, I don't, I'm not an Afro-pessimist, you know what I mean? And I always fight against that. So everything that comes from Africa is, there is no way we can regress. And my hope, my really hope is see the civil society. See how civil society becomes so active in Africa. We spoke about people rejoicing about coup. Today in Africa, people are speaking more often and more bravely against oppression of any kind than it used to be in the past. That's where the hope is, the grassroots movement. It is spreading in Africa. So the next time, we should discuss about how civil society is taking over the informal economy, the informal this and all that. It is very dynamic right now. It's a good time to be in Africa, by the way, compared to where you are.
On that light note, thank you so much, Dr. Mwanasali and Ambassador Mbuende, for your time. And I hope that we can continue this conversation in person at some point. I hope you can visit us in Denver. And I hope I can come to Addis soon, since it's a good time to be in Africa, Dr. Mwanasali.
Okay, no, it's very exciting. I can tell you, come visit. There is no COVID here. We are fine, okay? Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for viewers. All right, bye-bye.
And see you,
bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you in Denver.
All right.